Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Ulysses Grant, and the focus is my Ulysses. Ulysses Grant actually had some of the deepest roots of any president in American history in terms of North American soil, as his relatives came over in the early 17th century, just about a decade after the Pilgrims. You've got Matthew and Priscilla Grant showing up in Boston Harbor, coming over from England. They settled in nearby Dorchester. Family stayed in that area. Fast forward a few generations, and you've got Grant's grandfather, Noah, fighting in one of the first battles of the Revolutionary War, Battle of Bunker Hill. And then things began to change, though, with Grant's father, Jesse. Decided to take a move. He wanted to set up a tannery, go out on his own, headed out for the frontier, and he ended up in Maysville, Kentucky. But he didn't stay there very long. Jesse Grant abhorred slavery. He was an abolitionist far before it was popular even in the North. And he was not about to stay in this area of Kentucky where slavery was permitted. So he and his new bride, the former Hannah Simpson, packed up. They went north and they ended up in Point Pleasant, Ohio to set up the tanning business. Now, the tanning business was a kind of an awful business. This was the practice of strengthening animals' skin so that it will resist decay and eventually turn into leather goods. But it was exhausting manual labor, a terrific or horrific odor from the chemicals involved in this process. But the work was in demand, and Jesse Grant prospered. He did quite well in building his business in Point Pleasant, Ohio. It's also where he and Hannah started a family. First boy, arriving April 27th, 1822, 10-pound boy, the first of 6 children, Hiram Ulysses Grant. That's what they named their boy. He was always my Ulysses to his father. The father, Jesse Grant, doted on his son, but even he admitted that Grant was more like his mother. He rarely ever laughs, never sheds a tear or becomes excited, never says a profane word or indulges in jokes. So what was Grant known for as a youngster? His love of animals, particularly horses. Almost a symbiotic relationship he had with horses, where he could tame the wildest beast, ride anything, ride any way. Did a lot of trick riding where he would stand on the horse, sometimes even on one leg, parade around town, catch people's attention. He even at a fairly young age bought a horse and started his own transport service, so he even made a little bit of money. And it wasn't just horses that Grant loved. He loved all animals. If he would go on a hunting expedition with his friends, he'd never take out his rifle. He wouldn't shoot an animal. That wasn't in his DNA. Well, education was very important to the Grant family, and they started Ulysses out at a fairly young age, went to the Maysville Academy, followed by the Rankin Academy run by abolitionists. Again, this is part of the ideological thought process transferred from Jesse Grant to Ulysses Grant really throughout his youth. Grant excelled in math. He excelled in art. He loved to sketch, especially horses, like this one. But he also then had to figure out what he was going to do from a career standpoint. And his father wanted him to go into the family business, the tanning business, and Grant wasn't interested. He told his father that this tanning is not the kind of work I like. I'll work at it, though, if you wish me to, until I'm 21. But you may depend on it, I'll never work a day at it after that. Well, Jesse Grant didn't like hearing this, but he also didn't want to force his son into doing something that he didn't really want to do, so looking for alternatives. He wanted to send him maybe to some more education, get a higher degree of some sort, more training, but he didn't have the money to do that. But then there was an opportunity that crossed his mind. Maybe he could send Grant to the best engineering school in the entire country, which happened to come at no cost. Where was this? The U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Well, to do this, Jesse Grant had to get a congressional appointment. It's the way the process worked then, it's the way it works now. And he had actually had a run-in not that long ago with his congressman, Thomas Hamer. But he approached Hamer, patched things up. Hamer said, you know what, I'll put in the recommendation for Grant to go to West Point, but there was now only one problem left. Jesse Grant hadn't talked to his son about this at all, and Grant told his father, not only he doesn't want to go, but I won't go. To which Grant later told him that his father said he thought I would, and I thought so too if he did, emphasis from Grant's original writing. And so he did. Age of 17, all of 5'1", Grant, a tiny guy at the age of 17, off on his first trip outside of the Midwest. The frontier life is now moving behind him, at least temporarily, as he's heading to New York. First time on a railroad, first time on a steamboat. Pretty impressive new technologies that he was finding. Finally shows up at West Point, and there's a problem. He goes to register, tells them, Hiram Ulysses Grant here. And they said, we don't have a registration by anybody of that name. So Grant's a little confused. He says, okay, well, what about Ulysses Hiram Grant? Because, of course, he was known much more as Ulysses. Well, they didn't have that name either. They did have a Ulysses Simpson Grant. Now, Simpson was his mother's married name, but he'd never gone by Ulysses Simpson Grant before. He said that's wrong. Well, he surmised that Congressman Hamer must have done this. He only knew Grant by the name Ulysses. Maybe he had put his mother's maiden name in there as a middle name because that's all he could come up with, never checked. And so now Grant had a little decision to make because he was told, you either come in as Ulysses Simpson Grant or you don't come in at all, because only the Secretary of War could make a change like this. And Grant said, well, we don't want to go bother the Secretary of War. I'll take it. Well, this gave his classmates a lot of fun because now his initials were USG. The US could be United States Grant. Uncle Sam Grant was the one that caught on, and this is how Hiram Ulysses Grant, my Ulysses, became known to his friends in the military as Sam. Well, they did have an engineering focus at West Point. Best prospects, again, for Grant were in math and art. Art being important in the military for the ability to create detailed maps, for which Grant was actually quite good. Not so great in all the topics, really struggled in French, and he really chafed at some of the things that happened at West Point, including instruction, dancing. They were forced to dance, and that's something that Grant said he would never do ever again after he left West Point. He never did. He also had very little value in the excessive discipline that took place at the academy. All these demerits that were being handed out for relatively minor infractions. Frankly, Grant didn't see the point. Well, the academy at the time housed a bunch of names that would become very familiar as generals in the war coming out 2 decades later. This is the early 1840s where they're all studying in the same room. 20 years later, they'd be fighting each other as many of the leading generals on the Union and Confederate sides in the Civil War were classmates at the academy with Grant. You've got William Sherman, George McClellan, George Thomas, Don Buell, William Rosecrans, all former Union generals as part of this class. But on the Confederate side, alongside them, you've got James Longstreet, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Simon Buckner, A.P. Hill, George Pickett, all part of this graduating class in the early 1840s. Grant's senior year, you got another player comes into the mix by the name of Fred Dent, Grant's roommate, originally from St. Louis. We'll talk more about him in a moment. Also interesting, Grant became the president of the Dialectic Society at West Point. Kind of a big honor, but interesting given that Grant actually abhorred public speaking and almost tried to do anything he could to get out of it, certainly even during his political career. Greatest joy for Grant at West Point? Riding horses, and there were plenty of them, and he would again take on the most challenging tasks, and he was clearly the best rider in all of West Point, and they noticed it and they gave him the honor at commencement. Chance to be on display. Now, Grant finished kind of an unremarkable 21st out of the 39 people who graduated in that class of June 1843, but the big moment came with the ceremonial leap over a bar at graduation where Grant took his horse to that full gallop, and to kind of the amazement of the onlookers, he cleared 6'3". 6'3". Nobody ever done that before. That's the highest achievement in Academy history to date. Well, would Grant miss the academy and life at West Point? He absolutely would. He said, I do love the place. It seems as though I could live here always if my friends would only come too. But now it's time to move on. Time to go out on his own into the world. He had actually grown 6 inches, still only 5'7", but a little bigger than when he started. He wanted the dragoons, obviously, to be able to ride horses, but because of his class rank, he didn't get his first choice. Ended up in the infantry, signed to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. First stop, though, his parents in Ohio wanted to go see them. He showed up his first dress uniform. So proud, put it on, rode off to the nearby city of Cincinnati, was going to, again, show off to the local population. And what happened? He got ridiculed. People made fun of him for being in this fancy military uniform, and it stung Grant. It actually had an impact. One of the reasons why he forever kind of shunned the fancy military dress that some gravitated toward. Well, Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, now out on his own really for the first time, and Ulysses Grant was bored. He was lonely. The Army life, it wasn't much going on. They were stationed mostly on the frontier, primarily to protect against Indian attacks. At this time, there wasn't a lot of activity. He even considered reaching out back to the folks at West Point. Maybe he'd go back, teach a class in math. That would be a better assignment than sitting out here on the frontier with nothing to do. Well, his senior year roommate, Fred Dent, he had come from St. Louis, and he recommended to Grant, why don't you go visit my parents? They're my family. They're in this place called Winter Haven, just outside the city. Go meet with them, and at least you'll have some people that you can hang out with. Well, Frederick and Ellen Dent, living with their couple of daughters, were the exact opposite of Ulysses Grant's parents and family. These were Southern Democrats who were very pro-slavery. But Grant actually enjoyed the company of the Grant family, and he started going out there occasionally, and then he started going out there a lot more when something changed. The other daughter, 18-year-old Julia, came back from boarding school. And now this was a big attraction for Ulysses Grant. He was smitten almost from the start. Now he's showing up at the Dent house almost every day. They would read novels together. She would play the piano. They would sing together. They'd go on horseback rides together. This was getting very close very fast. Well, Grant was about to be reassigned, and he had a decision to make, and the decision he made was to express his love to Julia and offer her his class ring, and she said no. She thought it was too fast, too soon, maybe sometime, but kind of shut him down. Well, Grant was despondent over this, but he didn't give up. Just about as he was ready to be redeployed, he went back to Julia. They were actually on a buggy ride going to a wedding together where he popped the question, he proposed marriage, and this time she accepted. But in secret. They didn't tell anybody yet, but they had at least become committed to each other. It gave Grant a lot of peace of mind because he didn't even know it yet, but he was about to go off to war. But that's the story for another day. That is Ulysses Grant and My Ulysses from the life of Ulysses Grant. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.